All right, welcome back, and good to have you back again with us. If you haven't already done so, you'll want to turn to Ecclesiastes in your Bible so that you can refer to it, because we will be referring to it from time to time. Now, Ecclesiastes, an interesting book, and with all the books that I study and so on, chapter 12 would be my favorite chapter of this book. And the reason for that is because of the poetic nature that the writer of Ecclesiastes talks about old age. It's quite interesting, the poetic nature in which he does that. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. As you know, we're in Ecclesiastes tonight, continuing on in the wisdom literature books. And we finished Proverbs last week, so now we're into Ecclesiastes, one of those great, intriguing books of the Old Testament that imparts again to us, just as Proverbs did, when we were talking about it last week, imparts to us the practical nature of understanding life. Understanding life from two perspectives. Here's what life is like apart from God. Here's what life is like with God. And that's really a cursory summary of the book of Ecclesiastes. And so by way of introduction, here's what we would say, that Ecclesiastes is a book that investigates life and tells us what kind of life is worth living. That's the key there. And the Ecclesiastes author brings that point and drives that point home to us. So basically, as we read through this book, it is the quest of the soul. Okay, it's the quest of the soul who sees only vanity about him, vanity or emptiness, right? Sees vanity all about him until his eyes are open to the hope that's offered by God. So again, those two perspectives or worldviews that the author gives us. Life without God, or living life without God, empty. Vanity, you've probably heard this before. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, right? Or emptiness, emptiness, right? But, and that seems to be how life is for the author until they come to that recognition and realization that when you live life with God, that changes your whole perspective. Okay? So then, this book has been described as a confession of failure and pessimism when God is excluded. If you only go partway through this book, you can get very discouraged. You can get very discouraged about life.
Well, that's what happened to me. I started reading that at one time.
Okay?
It's not me. I'm going this way.
Right. Yeah, no. If we only read partway through Ecclesiastes, you can get very discouraged because life looks rather dim without God. And it's true. Life is dim without God. That's why we have to read all of the book, right? Right through to the end of chapter 12. So, as you already know then, 12 chapters to this book. Not a large book by any stretch. But what I've done is I've taken those 12 chapters and divided them up into 3 sections. First 2 chapters, chapters 1 and 2, we deal with humanity's problem being declared. Okay, and so what happens is that the writer of Ecclesiastes declares for us in the first 2 chapters what the problem is. Not what is his problem personally, but what the problem of life is for all of us, okay? Including himself. In fact, he'll take the rest of the book, chapters 3 through 10, to then discuss humanity's problem. So he'll first of all declare in the first 2 chapters what the problem is, and then for the next majority of the book, the majority section of the book, he'll talk about what that problem is and the reason why it's a problem, so that by the time we come to the last 2 chapters, we have humanity's problem decided. All right? Humanity's problem is, how do we get out of life what we can get out of life apart from God? It looks like this without God, but boy, it looks so different with God, and that's the key with regard to this book. By way of background, not many details are known, really, about the immediate setting of Ecclesiastes. Historically speaking, or the historical context, we really don't understand or know. Other than we would say that the writing of this was probably toward the end of the author's life, but that's about as far as we can go, because there's no detail in here that gives us a historical context. So we're left in the dark with regard to that. But let's go to the title, because the title does do some explanation for us. The title of the book comes from the opening phrase, the words of the preacher. Okay? So, as it did for Proverbs, okay, so with the book of Ecclesiastes. We gain the title from the, the opening phrase, the words of the preacher. We find that in the first verse of the first chapter. Words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, this word preacher that the writer uses has a kind of a distinct, it's a distinct word that we find here. And if we trace the word preacher back to the original Hebrew text, then in Hebrew the word is kohelet, okay, which means to assemble. All right, and back in my days when I was taking Hebrew classes, that was one of our basic vocab words, kohelet, okay, which means to assemble. That's where the word preacher comes from in our English. When the Greeks began to take the Hebrew Old Testament and translate it into the Greek, right, then the word that was used for preacher was Ecclesiastes, okay, so ek, the first part of the word, ek means out of, okay, it's a preposition in the Greek, and then klesis means a calling, okay, so calling out, okay, or what a preacher does. What does he do? He calls out, right? So that's where we get the English title. It comes from the Greek, okay, Ecclesiastes talking about the preacher, so that by the time we get to our English, where we talk about the word preacher, of course we're speaking about one who speaks to an assembly of people, right? So that's where that title comes from, okay? In case you wanted to know, because Ecclesiastes is kind of a different term for us. We're not really familiar with it. We don't really use it often in our language. We might talk about ecclesiastical things, or we might talk about ecclesiology, which is the study of the church, right? But it's not a word that we've come across very often in our English language. But we're referring to the preacher, because that's what this book is about. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. In fact, this word is so rare that it's not found in any other Old Testament book. Okay? That's how rare this word is.
My Bible says teacher.
Yep.
It's the same.
Same thing. Yep. They just translated it a little differently. Yep. All right? So that's how we get the title. Question, of course, is who's the author, right? That's a lot of the questions that we often have when we're looking at these books. Again, the author is not named in the Bible text, but there does seem to be some strong hints for us when we take a look at it. In the first verse again of the first chapter, the author is identified, quote, as the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Well, if we're talking about the son of David, king of Jerusalem, then by process of elimination, we come up with who? We come up with Solomon, right? And internal evidences would favor, again, the traditional view. It's considered to the traditional view to look at the author of Ecclesiastes being Solomon. We feel that that's what's meant by the phrase. Now, you're going to always, and you'll find this in reading things about the Bible, you'll always find somebody that doesn't necessarily agree. And they'll go through all kinds of lengths and gymnastics to try and prove their point. But I think we have sufficient amount of evidence, even internal evidence, more than just the first verse, by the way, that helps us understand that we are probably talking about Solomon. In fact, I find 4 descriptions here in the text that coincide with what is known about Solomon from the historical record that we have. For example, the author talks about his unrivaled wisdom. Notice verse 16 in the first chapter. The author writes, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. Well, if that's not a description of Solomon, then who would it be a description of, right? If we were to take a look at verse 8 in chapter 2, the author describes his wealth. Notice what he writes. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. Okay? And well, we know from the historical record that Solomon was very wealthy during his reign. If we go up to verses 4 through 6, the author describes his building projects. So we're again in chapter 2, picking it up in verse 4. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. Talking about his building projects, and that's one of the things that we know Solomon was known for, his building projects. His greatest building project, of course, was the temple, right? But that wasn't his only building project. And then if we take a look at the last chapter, chapter 12, notice what the author writes about himself in verse 9. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 9. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many, what? Many proverbs. Well, we remember we talked about how many proverbs Solomon wrote during his time, and the record was kept for us in Second Kings. I think it was, or First Kings. One of the kings, anyway, one of those books. And how many proverbs? 3,000 at least, right? So just looking at the empirical evidence as the preacher talks about himself, right? As he writes about himself, I think we're on pretty good solid ground here in saying and determining that I think probably the author of Ecclesiastes is Solomon, all right? I think it's going to be difficult to try and convince of any other person but, because it fits so well. All right, so we're going to go with Solomon being the writer of Ecclesiastes.
So from those things, Pastor, it sounds like he had a pretty big ego.
It could be interpreted that way, yes. Yes. But what he finds out as he talks about these things, he realizes that even with all these things that he talks about himself, he continues to say, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. I've been able to do this, I've been able to amass that, I've been able to realize this, I've had all this, and what has it got me? Nothing.
Still not happy.
Still not happy. Still not fulfilled. Not satisfied, okay? And so it may sound like he has an ego, that's right, but what he's talking about is the fact that look at all that I've been able to accomplish, and look at what it's done for me. It hasn't satisfied. Life without God is never satisfying. Okay? That's why he talks about what he talks about, especially in chapter 12. The style of this book is interesting as well, because again, we do classify this book as part of the wisdom literature, right? That we find in the Old Testament. And the style basically is that of the philosopher. If you're one who is into philosophy, you like the study of philosophy, or you like reading philosophy, Ecclesiastes is a book for you. Okay, it'll be one that you'll identify with, because that's the style in which it is written. It's the style of the philosopher, and what he does is he shares his observations, his reflections, his reasonings, his conclusions, and he does all of this in terse and brief lines, mostly in a poetical form. Again, just as Solomon did with Proverbs, so he does with Ecclesiastes, and writes in a poetic style. Those short, terse statements, those proverbial statements we often talk about, same style in Ecclesiastes. Okay, so a lot of comparison will take place, and so on. And that's the style in which Ecclesiastes is written. But what about the prominent subjects of this book? What does this book talk about? Well, again, as we began with in our introduction, basically we're talking here about two life views. Okay? The author, what he does is he views things around him as the natural person would do. Okay? How does the natural person view life? views life without the light of any divine revelation, right? We don't want to have God involved in the equation because that changes everything when we begin to do that. So what the natural person does is views life without any inkling of some type of divine revelation, and the conclusion again that Solomon comes to, the conclusion that the writer of Ecclesiastes comes to, is this: vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Life is empty when left to our own resources. Life is empty when God is not involved. Life does not satisfy if God is not involved. And not only did Solomon see that, but I don't think we have to go very far to realize that even in our own culture today, right? What is the number one problem that we in our North American affluent society have? What's our number one problem in life? We're bored. We're bored silly. And so that's why we find all kinds of ways to try and alleviate the boredom that we have in life, right? We'll buy and subscribe to all kinds of things that are designed to designed to fill time, right? Nobody wants to work, everybody wants to play, right? But when we get to the time to play, what happens? We're bored, okay? And that's what life is like when God is not involved. Then what happens is that the author writes as one to whom God has revealed himself. And when that happens, now his observations and his conclusions, what happens now is they change. They have a ring of surety and hope. It's no longer vanity, but now there's a hope involved here. Let's go to chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. This is after we get through that famous first 8 verses of chapter 3, right? To everything there is a season, right? Okay, and verse 14, notice what Solomon writes. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it, that men should fear before him. See the change in attitude? See the change in perspective? Okay? First of all, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. But now that God's involved, everything changes. And there's a surety and there is a hope to the things that he wants to talk about. So, here's basically what's happening. Here's the purposes behind Ecclesiastes. It's to show the futility of pursuing materialistic earthly goals as an end in themselves. Okay? Nothing wrong with the things, with a lot of things in life. Okay, so let's not go too far with trying to make a point that doesn't exist. Solomon isn't saying that life, or that we can't enjoy life, or that life is not to be enjoyed. Oh yes, it is. Okay, but without God, you'll never be fulfilled. So if all we're doing is pursuing materialistic earthly goals as an end in themselves, we find emptiness. But when God is the source of all that is truly good, that changes the perspective in its entirety. We look at life differently. And that was Solomon's experience. Life was like this without God, but then when God became involved again, this is how life is. And it's something to be enjoyed, and it's something to pursue, and it's something to be involved in wholeheartedly. Okay? So that's basically what Ecclesiastes is about, and the main subject of the discussion. 2 life views. Here's life without God, here's life with God. Okay? But let's talk about vanity for a little bit. And again, we're not talking about that cute little counter and sink that you have in your bathroom. Okay? That we often in Canadian culture talk about a vanity, right? But what we're talking about is this word that Solomon uses throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Or when he's talking about vanity, he's talking about emptiness. And it's interesting, the topics that Solomon covers when he talks about emptiness, when he talks about vanity. For example, he talks about the vanity of human wisdom. Okay? If we go back to chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, notice again what he writes in verses 15 and 16 of chapter 2. in Ecclesiastes. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. There's no difference between the two. Wisdom doesn't fulfill. Okay? So he talks about the vanity of human wisdom. If we go down a little further in the chapter, he also talks about the vanity or the emptiness of human labor. Some love this portion of Ecclesiastes. Let's pick it up in verse 19. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned to my heart and despaired for all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. So what was Solomon saying? Here I work and I work and I labor, and what's the end result? When I die, everything that I worked for is gone, and the guy who didn't work for it inherits it. Okay? The vanity of human labor, right? You can't take it with you. And somebody else is going to receive all of the benefits of your labor. If we're looking at life without God, that's how human labor looks. Okay? He talks about this even behind the purposes of life. Notice the last verse of chapter 2. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. To live life without God, there's no substance. It's like trying to catch the breeze in your hand. It just keeps escaping you. Okay? You need to have a purpose. So human purpose in itself, without God, emptiness. Oh, Solomon isn't done yet. He's going to talk about human rivalry and how that itself is empty as well. Notice what he writes in verse 4 of chapter 4. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity in grasping for the wind. Oh, if I could have what they have. Right? and we'll work to try and attain what it is that my neighbor has, that rivalry that comes. And Solomon says, you know what? It doesn't fulfill. It's empty. It's like trying to catch the wind in your hand. Notice verse 8 of the same chapter. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Human greed, the pursuit of material wealth, empty. And the person who's writing about this is still regarded as one of the richest human beings that ever lived. Ever lived. Bill Gates had nothing on. Okay? Warren Buffett didn't have anything on. Donald Trump had nothing on, as far as the comparison of the amount of wealth that Solomon had compared to these individuals. And Solomon was able to say, you know what, human greed doesn't fulfill. Doesn't fulfill. It's empty. By the way, Solomon still isn't done. He wants to talk too about the emptiness of human fame. Notice verse 16. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who came afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a grasping for the wind. The position, the prestige that the king had. I mean, if you dare to whisper the word Solomon in his kingdom, everybody knew who you were talking about. You were talking about Solomon the king. That's all you were talking about. That's how famous he was. But yet, what did Solomon say? You know what? Even that. Acquiring fame. That's it. It doesn't fulfill it. He goes on. Chapter 5 talks about this tendency for human insidiousness. Okay, what we mean by that is we're never, ever fulfilled. Right? Chapter 5, verse 10. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Somebody asked, I think it was J.P. Rockefeller one time, how will you know when you have enough money? And his answer was, when I have one more dollar. Okay? What was he saying by that? When I get that dollar, I'll still want one more dollar. When I get that one, how many will I want? I'll still want one more dollar. J.P. Rockefeller knew about the factor of human insidiousness, okay? And the factor that we can't fulfill ourselves, even with the material. We're never satisfied. Okay? Vanity, the emptiness of this. What about human coveting? Notice what he writes in chapter 6 and verse 9. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. Okay? Coveting, wishing, desiring, scheming, planning to acquire the things that somebody else has, right? That doesn't satisfy. Even human frivolity cannot satisfy. Notice what he writes in verse 4 of chapter 7. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. He's talking about mirth there. He's talking about, the pursuits of pleasure, that which helps us avoid at all costs pain, the ability to be able to somehow realize or go through life with always a smile on our face and a spring in our step and the laughter ringing in our ears, right? Solomon says that doesn't even satisfy. Now, is he saying that we should always be mournful? No, that's not what he's saying. He's just saying, understand, the pursuits of pleasure, they will not fulfill either. It might be fun for a while, but guess what? You'll get bored. You'll get bored, just like we do in our life today. Even when it comes down to what we're able to accomplish, the awards of life that we might be able to attain. Solomon talks about the emptiness of that as well. Notice chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the palace of holiness, from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is also vanity. Skip down to verse 14. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said this also is vanity. Those things that we pursue to get recognition, right? And the wicked will receive recognition. The righteous will receive recognition. It doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on. Morally, you'll be recognized for something. And what is it? Empty. So again, if we do not read all of the book of Ecclesiastes, what is the conclusion that we're forced to about life? We could basically say this: why bother? Why bother? If it's all empty, if it's not going to satisfy, and if I come to the conclusion of understanding that life on my own and life on my own terms does not satisfy, then why bother? There's no purpose. But that's why the last part of Ecclesiastes is so important, because what, again, Solomon does for us, when we go into the last part of this book, what he does for us is he brings together the final say of it all. Basically, when we come to verse 9 of chapter 11, notice what Solomon writes. Verse 9 of chapter 11. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. Now notice verse 1. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. And then for these next number of verses, he talks about the perils of growing old in poetic form, right? While the sun and lights and the moon and the stars are not darkened and the clouds do not return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few. What's he talking about there? Teeth. And then you get older, what happens to your teeth? You start to lose them, right? And he'll go through all of that to talk about the perils of growing old. And then when we get to verse 9, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of the scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these. Of making many books there is no end, of much study is wearisome to the flesh. We used to recite that all the time in Bible college. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Here it is. Solomon's final statement to deal with all of what he's been talking about. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. What is Solomon saying? You want to have a life that's fulfilling? Have God involved. Any other way won't be fulfilling. It won't work. It's empty. It's vanity.
You just have to look at people and know that there's just a hardness to their looks. They're not happy.
Yep. Again, in this culture, we're bored silly. And we don't know how to fill our time. And then, at times, we will fill our time with all kinds of things that we find in the long run only damage us rather than help us. Right?
That's why I got 2 dogs.
There you go.
Poor Julie.
No, I didn't mean it.
So let's get down to that final question.
Sounded funny.
Let's get down to that final question. So what? Well, we've I think, answered a lot of so what to this point. But 4 things that I want to bring out specifically. First of all, let's remember this. Every pursuit of people is futile if God is excluded. That's really the bottom line of Ecclesiastes. Every pursuit of people is futile if God is excluded. And I may sound harsh here. I'm not trying to sound harsh. But you know, when we look around us and we see, in our context here, all the toys that people have, and still, it doesn't fulfill. The pursuit of whatever, happiness, pursuit of prestige, the pursuit of wealth, whatever you want to call it in our society, right? Without God involved, when God is excluded, it's a futile pursuit. Because again, with the number of funerals that I have done, and I have done quite a few over my years of ministry, I have yet to see anything coming along behind the hearse when we're heading out to the cemetery. All that's coming and all that's following the hearse out of the cemetery are the loved ones and the friends that are left behind. And once the words are said at the graveside that are said, what happens to those people when they have come? They leave. And the person who was remembered is left by themselves at the cemetery. And nobody's there. Every pursuit of people is futile if God is not involved, if God is excluded. Secondly, all right, whose work endures? Only God's work endures. Human work will not endure forever. But God's work endures so that only He can impart true value to people's lives and service. I've had some people say to me, in a moment of honesty, my life is worthless. And I've had the opportunity in those times to say, no, your life isn't worthless. You just view it as so. When God becomes involved in your life, that's when the value comes in. When God is involved in your life, that's when purpose comes in. When God is involved in your life, the things that you're doing now have a purpose behind them. Prior to God being involved, I would agree with you. Yeah. It's hard to find purpose in life. It's hard to find purpose behind what it is that you do. Right? I mean, how many times do we come across a person who gets up in the morning, right? And when they recognize that it's a new morning, and when they recognize again that it's a weekday morning, what usually happens? Oh, I gotta go to work. No purpose. No purpose behind what it is that you're doing. But when you wake up in relationship with God, and when you recognize that as God is involved in your life, and you are doing what God has called you to do, then when you get up, rather than saying, oh, I gotta go to work, what we're saying now, because God brings true value into what it is that we live in life and what it is that we do in life, when that's happening, then when we get up, we say, hey, I gotta go to work. There's a difference, you see, because God is now involved. And that's the point that Solomon is making when he writes what he writes in Ecclesiastes. Also, here's something else. There's nothing new under the sun. I don't know how many times, I'd have to go back and count them up again, but many, many times, here's the phrase that Solomon keeps repeating throughout his book. There's nothing new under the sun. We've seen it before. It may not exactly look the same every time, but you strip it down to its base, and what you've got is basically the exact same thing that we've had before. Oh yeah, we remember that. We remember when we used to have that, or what have you, right? Or we remember when we used to have that kind of point of view, or those kinds of... There's really nothing new under the sun. Hence why we're bored. There's really nothing new under the sun. And with that in mind, that also reminds us that if there is nothing new under the sun, God isn't surprised with anything that comes our way. God is not surprised with anything that happens or takes place. He's not surprised because really it's nothing new. It's really nothing new. It's been done before. It's been tried before. It's been attempted before. And we could even apply this to some of the cultural phenomena that we have today, right? When we're, Clark was talking a little earlier about Boko Haram in Kenya and what they did earlier today at the university in University College in Nairobi. What ISIS is doing over in Syria and Iraq, right? And so on. And we take a look at this and the atrocities and the tragedies that take place in the hands of people, right? And when we strip it down back to its base, what could we say about all this? ISIS is a new phenomenon. ISIL is a new phenomenon. This new phenomenon of Boko Haram and all the rest of it. Not really. Nothing's new under the sun. Unfortunately, if we look back in history, what do we find? We find segments of people trying to rally different causes, whatever, and for those different causes that they are passionate about, what have they been guilty of doing? Taking people's lives, terrorizing people. It's all been under another leader and another name, but it's still the same, is it not? And rather than be surprised, we ought not to be. Rather than be surprised, what we need to do is we need to be saying, okay, how do I respond to this? What does God want of me? How do I respond to this? Knowing that God is the one who is at the center of my life, right? There's really nothing new under the sun, and Solomon reminds us of that. In fact, Oswald Chambers basically took the book of Ecclesiastes and reduced it down to one sentence. And here's what he said. Life is not worth living apart from redemption. It's really what Ecclesiastes is about. Without God, why bother? But when God is involved, that's what now gives us purpose. When God is involved, that's what gives us drive. When God is involved, that's